Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. And the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel. And it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. Now, often when we think about the world, we're thinking about the things that out there that grab the headlines, that get public attention or scrutiny by experts. We think that's the world that matters. But of course, for most of us, often the world that we experience every day is, well, just much more seemingly mundane. Like last night, my world was preparing for guests, cooking with my wife, Jody, arranging and organizing the house, welcoming the guests, spending time talking with them, listening to music over dinner, putting away the leftovers, washing the dishes. That was our world. And that's a world we need to make sense of also. How do we find sense and especially God amidst the everyday world? And it's a question that I'm so glad to explore with my guests for today. My guests are multi-Grammy award-winning musician Charlie Peacock and his wife and author Andi Ashworth, who have written their latest book that they've co-authored, Why Everything That Doesn't Matter Matters So Much. Andi and Charlie, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. It's just wonderful to have you here.
Thanks, Curtis.
Thank
It's
you,
so
Curtis.
good to be here.
I really love the title of your book, Why Everything Doesn't Matter. All these things that we think are just mundane and ordinary, you are really trying to bring out why they matter so much. So, Andi, let me start with you because you and Charlie have written many books. Why did you both feel compelled to write this particular book at this time?
I think it was, for one thing, Curtis, it was our age. We felt like we were old enough to do some reflecting and tell some stories. And we had quite a bit of life to draw from at this point in our later 60s. And I've always had just this desire to really talk about the greatness of small things, I guess I would call it. And because I have been writing in diaries and journals for many, many years, 40 years now, I think it's given me a lens through which to look at what a week or a day might be made of. And it is so much, as you say, it's all those things that we do that continue, that allow for life to continue on and people to be cared for and relationships to happen. And then all the other things we're making at the same time, or, you know, whether they're grand or they're small or they're memories or music or books or, you know, all these different kinds of things, but they all fit like puzzle pieces. And so it's a way of, you know, just bringing vision to the importance of a whole life that we're given rather than just the big visible things.
Well, that's a good question, Charlie, for you, because you get the big visibility in your performance as a musician. So tell me how this focus on the small and invisible to most of the public, how have you related to this part of your world?
I think my career has actually helped us to get at a theology because of the contrast, the dramatic contrast between human endeavor that produces the sound of applause and rings the cash register over human endeavor that may bear tremendous fruit and be very meaningful. And so I think we've had to live in that tension for so long. And it's just caused us to really give it some attention and to ask ourselves, what do we really think about this and believe about this? And most importantly, what do we understand in terms of the Jesus story, and what is the path that we're meant to follow and articulate in the midst of this tension? And so for me, you know, I've had to come to the place where you can see that very quickly that the things that can be monetized get the attention, right?
Yeah.
So any of us can immediately analyze our lives and say like, oh, I see why that's getting so much attention. It's because it's the thing that's monetized, or it's the thing that, I have these relationships with people that are all transactional, right? And so that's why they get all of the kind of heat and interest, right? And so then you have to turn to those things that don't fall in that category. Oh. And you realize like, oh, okay, I have to be very careful here that I don't turn these things that are only monetized into the most important things. That I really, if I'm really going to live out my theology, what I truly believe about the depth of God's and width of God's creation, then I've got to give full credence, full power, full interest to all of it, and not constantly lean into whatever the world deems deserves applause or deserves monetization. So that has helped us. I mean, now keep in mind, we're also going to say that, as you introduced me, I'm happy to be a Grammy Award winning record producer, because in many ways it does make life easier. Right. So it opens doors for me to work on projects that I find very meaningful. So we hold that up too and say, okay, well, that's fine, but it will never define us, and it will never define even get close to defining our level of interest in the minutia of God's creation.
Well, I think that's why I've been so always interested in the relational life of artists who do have a public life and who have a lot of, as you said, relationships that get monetized, including with your audience, right? And because you do wonder, as somebody listening or watching somebody who is a artist, a celebrity, what are they like in their non-monetized, non-transactional relationships? Because that's feels to me like that's probably the real them that I'm not getting in a packaged experience like that. So, Andi, let me ask you, because you have that visibility and you are part of that relationship that is core to both of you, like describe this relationship. And I want to describe it not just like Charlie is like this. I want you to describe your relationship together, Charlie and Andi, because that's really the relationship that I think is the fruitful grounds of this book and your reflections. So kind of give our listeners a picture of the story of your relationship and how that's evolved.
Well, we started out together in high school, so a long, long time ago.
High school sweethearts.
In a land far away. Yeah. In Northern California. High school sweethearts, yeah. And we got married very young, when we were 18 and 19. I'm the older woman by 8 months. And we began a life together when we were just little young chicks and just barely out of the nest, trying to make a nest of our own. And we were in a community of artists immediately because of music. But we also had young children, and we were some of the only people that we knew at the time that had young children and that were married also. And really we had a pretty rough time of it for quite a while. And then we began to, we did come into faith in Jesus about 7 years after we were first married. And we began to change from the inside out, but also change the way we thought about definitely art, life, literature, children, family, friendships, beauty, flowers, meals. I mean, just everything, and we were just in a long period of the beginning of a long period of growing, which we're still in. And evolving and understanding and opening our arms, I think, wider and wider and wider all the time to embrace more that we understand that God loves than we knew at the beginning of all that.
Well, Charlie, I was going to ask you something that came out in this book as we're talking about finding God's meaning in the everyday. Andi wrote this beautiful chapter on finding cooking as a vocation. And I thought that was a beautiful way of describing cooking as a vocation versus as a chore. And this idea of actually not just it as something to get done, but really as a calling. Now, it just so happens Andi wrote that piece, and you can sort of get into, oh well, that's the woman's realm, and it's the woman's place in the kitchen, which I don't think is not what you guys were saying. This is why I wanted to ask you, Charlie, this question. How do you experience, even though Andi wrote that chapter, I'm curious, how do you experience cooking as a vocation? Are you part of that? Are you simply the recipient of that? How do you engage with that everyday part of life?
Yeah, I've been very engaged in it, and I'll explain how. I mean, first was that when we were first married, food preparation and cooking was a free-for-all. And Andi would have times where she would steer, she would drive, because she'd be passionate about making something. I'd be passionate about making something. We had a very short menu, though, of things that we made. But we did share, I think, in the beginning, we did share some ideas about food in terms of where it comes from, how it nourishes the body. And I think that she became much more proficient at it, much more studied, and a better student than me. But I certainly encouraged that. But I think the tipping point really for us in terms of food was I became friends with a percussionist who married a chef who was very much a part of the first wave of farm to table in Northern California. And Andi, and Kathy is her name, they became just fast friends. And I think Andi saw really for the first time, in the same way that I had seen through different musicians, she saw the artistry of cooking. And not only that, she was like incrementally developing a whole concept of table fellowship and the importance of that. We were seeing that take place with our young children, that this was a place where they learned a lot about conversation. And so it just seemed like, even though in the early days we would both cook and we would kind of go back and forth, and then we would argue over who was doing what. And it was really that Andi became the artist at it. She really became the artist. She had a community of people around her, and she began to fill her life with, as I said, not just the food preparation, but the philosophies behind it, whether it's table fellowship or the preparation of the food or a broader umbrella of hospitality. So then where I ended up entering in was like helping to build infrastructure for that. So like when we were, doing different remodeled versions of the art house, where we had practiced so much hospitality, I would be the person who would be like more in the design part of like, okay, this is, I want to jump in here and come alongside you. You're the artist, and let me be something of the equiper and helping get all the tools that you need, building the infrastructure, helping design the kitchen the way you want it, and all of that kind of stuff. So that's more where I've come alongside. And also I'll say this, that before I was a well-known musician, I was a pretty good dishwasher as a teenager and made a little bit of money. I think $1.35 an hour washing dishes. So I am still called upon to do that.
If the music career doesn't work out, Charlie, you've got something to fall back on.
That's
so
right.
that's good.
Right. Yeah.
Andi, Charlie's brought up the art house, and it struck me when I was reading the book that really is congruent with this idea of cooking as an everyday performance. And I love that vision, because really, if you think about it, I used to always struggle with, like, my wife is the artist of our marriage as a cook also, but I always thought, oh, that's so evanescent. Like, you spend 3 hours making this meal, you eat it, and it's gone.
Mm-hmm.
But then I suddenly realized, well, wait a minute, how is that different really from any public performance? You know, I mean, maybe there's a difference when you're getting recorded, but, like, you know, if Charlie, you go up and you play for a large crowd in a venue, that performance, once it's done, it's gone. It's just as evanescent as a meal is. And Andi, you know, I love this idea that you are bringing artistry to also an evanescent but still deeply meaningful performance that is a meal. And it struck me when I was reading your book that, oh, the art house is like, it's like the stadium, or it's the venue, it's the concert hall for the performance of many acts of hospitality, but especially food. So tell us more about the art house, Andi. Like, describe it for our listeners, the history of it, what was its vision? Because I think it's a beautiful picture of the performance of hospitality and creating a venue for that art.
First, I'll just say the Art House in Nashville is a place that we started in 1991, and it came from a vision, an idea that my husband was having while he was out on a European tour. And he came home and he was trying to explain to me that he was dreaming of a place where artists could gather for friendship and community and teaching. And, but it really involved having a place to come to. He already had a name for it. He had a little logo that he'd drawn in his journal. And we had, there was a place down the street from where we lived in Nashville. We'd only been in Nashville a year at that point, coming from California. And our children were, I guess, about 12 and
9.
No, I'm not sure what they were, but they were middle. They were
young,
middle-aged, middle-aged kids. And there was an old country church that was down the street from the house that we lived in. And that is the place that became the art house through a series of kind of wonderful, serendipitous provisions of God for this young couple, young family who were just trying to make it in the music business, didn't have very much money. And here was this big place, this big idea.
I had this idea, and it was really just based on wanting artists to have the opportunity to hear from people who had perhaps a little more fully orbed vision for the artistic life as disciples of Jesus. And so, because for me, I was obsessed with two questions. What does it mean to be a faithful artist, and what does it mean to be a faithful disciple? And how do those work together? I had no interest in being a Christian artist as a genre, but I really wanted to be a faithful Christian artist. And so it was, part of it was just my interest in the subject, you know, what we would call today the intersection of faith and arts. And so I just had this idea that we need a place, you know, we need a place that has some magnetism to it, that draws people to it and has some sort of iconic look that people will remember. And that's why we ended up at this, decommissioned Methodist church from the early 1900s that we converted into eventually, home, the art house, studios, offices, all of that on one piece of property. And it became a place of gathering where thousands of people came through there. our whole life was centered in hospitality, having, hosting events, weeks of educational topics that could range from Flannery O'Connor and literature to songwriting to what does the Bible say about imagination and creativity, all of that. So artist retreats, having authors and theologians come speak. And then it became sort of, when we had a lot of house guests and dinners, and then we began to host these larger retreats, which required, I think the most, tell me if I'm getting this right, but was the most people that we ever fed at a dinner there about 100 people or 90 people?
A little bit less, yeah.
Yeah, about 90 people. So imagine that. I mean, most families aren't going to have 90 people over for dinner.
Yeah.
So. But it will give your listeners some sense of the scale of it. And
that it could be that, but also, Curtis, it was in an ongoing way, house guests, people coming in from the studio to have dinner, or one-on-one, just conversations in front of the fireplace, or
that's right,
or in front of the garden, and so that's why all these things were blending together in this one place. And we were learning that not only was this something called the art house, but the art house, it became a life for us. And we had to learn how to value all the parts of it, whether it was, again, that just one person at a time conversation, or all that it took to just feed hungry people. I mean, so much of my interest and ability in the kitchen came because people come into your home and they're hungry. They're hungry for, food itself to nourish their bodies. They're hungry for a relationship. And you learn over time, especially as you're raising a family, this is a daily thing. Everybody has to do it. And so it's both the hunger for food and the hunger for a relationship. I think that became the driver for me to understand that it does disappear, as you're saying. It is this, and it's not always this great work of art. Sometimes it's just come in and share our leftovers, or we'll all have a pizza together, or it's all of those things, or it's a peanut butter sandwich. That's what we have, and we'd love to share it with you if you want that. But it's elevated, I think, for those two things, because God has made us to need food and to need relationships, and when we're together in the eating of the food, we're talking and we're sharing life, and we all become less lonely and more known. And
well, one of the things that it seems to me is this is a vision of a intentional hospitality that you have catalyzed in the art house, and I find expressions throughout kind of our tribe of Christians, if you will. I know Sandra McCracken is an art house board member. She's a friend of the pod. She was an artist for our project Songs of the After Party. I've heard her talk about this. As I understand it, the art house, there are other out houses in the country. Is that right?
Yes.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And this strikes me as the kind of the vision of the Rabbit Room with what the Petersons are doing.
Rabbit Room had some of their first meetings actually at the art house.
Absolutely.
Well, and so what would you like to see this vision? Because it seems to me it would be lovely to see more of these kinds of enterprises take place. But part of it, what I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you think you're embodying a vision that actually everyone could practice. You don't need to actually buy a property and start your own thing, give it a brand name. You're embodying a vision of life that anybody with a home can do. So can you guys speak to how the average listener who does not have a big property, does not have a big home, can still catch sort of the life-giving vision that you're talking about?
Yeah.
You're looking at me. Well, I'll tell you right now, we don't live in the art house anymore. We live in a home in a neighborhood. It's quite a bit more urban than where we were before. And I still long for the same I long for that community of knowing and being known. Mm-hmm. And so I try to be that person in the life that I have now. It looks different than it used to because, in those days we were always welcoming people to us. And now it's more, how are we willing to reach out to others in the dailiness of life and walking up and down the street? And I have a great interest in finding out kind of the stories behind the stories of who people are. So I like to ask a lot about, what formed you? What are the stories of the vocation of your life that you came to live out as an adult? And tell me more about that. And
let me interrupt you just for a second and just say that one practical way that Andi does this is that she has created a garden. We used to have these magnificent large gardens out at the art house. So she has a very small cottage garden in an enclosed area that there's an iron gate that you enter in from the street. So when she's out there writing in the morning on the porch, she intentionally opens the gate so that all the walkers and people who are walking in our neighborhood will be able to poke their head in and say hello and maybe get a conversation started. So I think that to me is such a great symbol of the yearning of your heart, is that gate. When I see you open that gate, I know it's like you're being neighborly. You're wanting to send a signal to people that I want to hear you, I want to see you, I want you to come in, and that to me is super inspiring.
Thank you.
It strikes me that you guys, as you've been doing that, you are really finding something that matters greatly in creating a home and, in a sense, opening up your family to others. As you do that, how does that connect with your own making sense of your own family life, your own family of origin life in particular? Because you write about that in your book, that you both come from families that you felt like you actually had to work through some stuff. And so I'd love to talk to us about this interaction between, as you are opening up yourselves to others, how does that interact with you actually opening up parts of yourselves to yourself? What is the interaction between this external welcoming of others and this internal examination of oneself? Andi, could you start there? And then Charlie, I'd love to hear how you think about that.
Boy, Curtis, I'm going to have to think about that for a minute.
It's drilled down pretty deep.
Yeah. Well, this kind of living was, just it really came in the very beginning for us. It came out of such a sense of gratitude, because we did have a hard beginning, and we had a hard beginning because we were just two kids who'd experienced quite a bit of trauma already, who kind of clung to each other as teenagers and then got married right out of high school and began to tumble into our lives together. And then later, we were just so grateful to be together, to have a family, to have a marriage still intact. And so that's how things, grew. It wasn't because we had, well, at least I hadn't. I had experienced hospitality in terms of there's a grandmother's dinner table and we all gather there, or parents who had friends over and people, dropped by. But that sense of more of an open door is not something we had experienced in the same way that we were given to live it out in our life. And so for me, I came up against a lot of tensions for myself inside of that, because although I really have a great capacity to be with people for a good length of time, to be in a long conversation, I do hit a wall and I need some space, and I'm an introvert. So, you know, I need relationship, but I also need time alone. And so we're working through all of these things, all of these years, and I'm learning those things about myself. And then also, you know, as an adult, beginning to understand that I had a lot of fear and anxiety that came from, you know, a lot of my growing up, and I was dealing with those things as a 30-something-year-old at the same time that we're beginning to have Art House. And so I'm kind of, all of that is woven into, you know, my life and our life together. And so I'm not sure how you would answer that.
Yeah. Well, I think from my perspective, my mother's side of the family was very, very hospitable, and a lot of gatherings. There still are today. I mean, they're still very much that way. So I was used to having, even when I was a teenager, you know, we had a lot of events at our house, and we had a pool, and, you know, people from the neighborhood would come over, a lot of barbecues, a lot of all that sort of gatherings. So I was very used to being what, you know, my grandparents would call neighborly. So just sort of as a basic way of being or walking through life. So I understood that. But I think for me, I was also, I don't know whether it's my jazz background or just my personality or what, but I'm very improvisational, and I can kind of turn on a dime pretty quickly. At least I had, you know, when I was a younger man, I would say that was more characteristic of me. And so very high adaptive and quick decision maker, but not always counting the cost of everything, right? As you may know, having some understanding of personality types or Enneagram or something like that, then you know that. So that was kind of my downside, is that not always counting the cost of my openness, right? Being open-hearted, open-handed, open resourcing, you know, all of that, without seldom counting the cost of its effect upon the family. You know, never really inquiring of the children, hey, Dad's thinking about doing this, what do you think? You know, it was just more like, and it wasn't like trying to be rude or trying to exclude someone. It was just more about how dependent I personally was on this combination of what I thought was what it meant to be faithful to following God, and this improvisational kind of like make it up as you go mentality. And eventually kind of found the dark side of that, you know, the side of that where it was like, you know, you really needed to hear the voice say, slow down, buddy, you know, and take into consideration more things than what you think is just your version of faithfulness. And that's when I began to mature a lot more, because I started to see that that my way of seeing or my ability to adapt quickly, sure, that could be a gift in some scenarios, but it could cause me to rush into things that might bring harm to others, or maybe the timing just wasn't right, you know, to have 100 people over at the house that weekend and things like that. I really had to learn that. So this external thing that was happening to us, of which most of it we were choosing, really did have an internal change on me as well. I definitely had to take an inward look often. And our book is really in many ways is kind of a step back assessment of a lot of that time.
We've been talking about this difference between the public life that we might live that gets a lot of attention and our private experiences that also constitutes our world. it seems to me one part of our human experience that often doesn't get the public attention is just everyday suffering. Suffering is not something that makes for good public consumption of an experience for an audience. It doesn't draw a lot of audience share, and so to speak. And so, Charlie, I want to ask you, because you write about your experience of everyday suffering that isn't probably known by your fans and your audience and so forth. So tell us about that experience and how you've made sense of it.
Yeah, I was at the kind of peak of my powers, in the empire building trade, and I had taken on the work of building a commercial music program at Lipscomb University here in Nashville. The idea was that, well, here's this guy that started out as a teenager and built this music career and must know something about sustainability. And so maybe there's a way to codify that to a certain degree and put that into a curriculum that can help young people to have sustainable music careers. So I came on board to do that. It wasn't long after I did that. And another thing I was at is I was in the best physical shape of my life. And this was in my late 50s. It wasn't long after I started that job developing that curriculum that I got very sick with a neurological disorder, which I still have to this day. And part of it, it has several parts to it, but the most significant is that I have had an intractable, migraine level headache for 7 years. So it's something that, I was just talking about adaptivity a moment ago, and I've met my match, I definitely went through a whole period of time where I could not adapt. The only thing I could do is just pretty much, come apart at the seams. And that changed me too. That I'm definitely not the same person I was 7 years ago. So there, and for good, which is the complete ironic mystery of the whole thing, I would love to be rid of the headache today, as long as I could keep all of the goodness that has come to Andi and I through the illness. So I've learned a lot about suffering over the last 7 years, and it's created a lot of empathy in me. I'm a lot less transactional than I was, and hopefully a better listener.
Curtis, if I might add in for a minute, just kind of part of our story is, because I want to give a realistic look to everybody who's listening, is that there is a cost, a physical, relational, emotional cost to living with a constant open door, which we lived with a pretty radical open door for
over
25 years. And then it had started before that too. But what we call in the book, just kind of a gradual crescendo of a too muchness, and the too muchness that we were both in our own different ways dealing with. So part of that is part of this story of kind of the crescendo of health caving in, and there was a lot more to it than that, but that was part of it.
Yeah. And also, I find it very interesting that the good things that we are able to do, our smallness, we're all just small little broken people, who may have extraordinary gifts or be wonderfully resourced for all kinds of projects. that are a part of what we hope are part of Jesus's kingdom project. But I just find it very interesting that you can point your compass towards good, and it's extremely attractive to all of us. I mean, when we see good and we want to replicate it, and we want to be a part of it, we want to come and join in, because our hearts hunger for that so much. But even with the art house, we had to learn that, we were just two small people, and that we had our limitations, and that not everything in the world is meant to be kind of sort of branded and institutionalized, or even replicated again and again. Not everything is served well by becoming ubiquitous. Some things really start to fall apart when you aim for ubiquity, and you aim for a big reach, a big kind of empire building reach. And not that, and I will say this for Andi, not that Andi ever had aspirations towards that, but I would admit that I probably did, because again, what was my orientation? I grew up in a world where if you weren't making gold and platinum records, you weren't doing anything. Yeah. Which is incredibly sad.
Yeah.
Because I didn't grow up with the notion that art could be good fruit first. I had to back my way into that idea. I started with a performance-based acceptance and had to work my way to grace. That doesn't even make sense. I had to.
It makes sense. We do actually have to. We do have to work our way to grace. I think that's an actual apt description of how this happens.
All right. Well, I'll let you. If you put your endorsement on it, then we'll go with it. But
well, it strikes me in one of the primary contexts that we get out of a performance-based mentality of the world, a transactional view towards our relationships, is if we are given by God's grace, the blessing of a marriage, of a fruitful, long marriage of love and commitment, which is, of course, filled also with challenges and struggles. This June, my wife and I will be celebrating our 30th anniversary. And I can give myself a pat on the back until I look at you guys and think, okay, they're at 50.
So we give you a pat.
Yeah, we'll give you a pat too. Yeah,
we'll give you good applause. Yeah.
All right, I'll take that from you guys. But 50 years of marriage, like, who doesn't want that? That's a beautiful picture. So give us your advice from the everyday, because I've had 30 years to know that what sustains a 30-year marriage is not the big commitments, the big decisions, they matter, but it's really the everyday. It's the everyday commitments and practices and gestures you make to one another that I think, actually sustain a 30-year marriage. I'm betting that is what sustains a 50-year marriage as well. Mm-hmm. And if my bet is correct, then speak to that. What are the everyday practices that each of you have found is really key to your marriage? And Andi, why don't you go first, and then Charlie, you chime in.
Okay. Well, I kind of want to open the book and get a refresher, but I think what matters most, I think it's the center. It's a central thing, and we're learning this. We're learning this in our late 60s and moving into our 50th year of marriage, which will be next May. Is that the best thing that we can do is to be a safe place for each other, so that so when you start out, it means there is a basic respect, there is a withholding of judgment in communication, so that you can actually be safe to say the things that you need to say, and you don't have that thought bubble outside of your head that's going, I I know I'm not safe to say this, so I just have to keep it in because I know what's going to happen if I say it.
Andi, what's an everyday gesture or response you make to Charlie to signal that he's safe with you? What does that actually look and feel or sound like?
Gosh, do you know? I think you would know better than I do.
Well, even if you say, let's have a check-in or things like that, then I know that your heart and mind are prepared to hear me. You know, we've discovered that one of the things that doesn't work is for us is sort of blindsiding each other, you know, or being like, you know, passing through the kitchen and kind of lobbing something in that like, wow, that deserves some attention, right?
Yeah.
And then, and one of the reasons why it doesn't work is that, like, perhaps we just crossing through the kitchen and I say something I need a decision on. You know, I've learned that that will never work because Andi is a processor. And so if I need to ask a question of her that I need an answer for, I need to begin doing that in such a way that she can have the time necessary to process it and doesn't feel that there's a pressure for her to give an answer right then. So that is just one of 100 things that, you know, I have finally, you know, incrementally over the years, you know, picked up on.
Yeah.
That makes it safe for her, you know, where I've like said, let's sit down for a minute, let's talk.
Yeah.
And we've just really found that this kind of like rushing past each other and hoping to get quick answers for things, that's a place where we can get really sideways. And so it's just important for us to have more intentional check-ins now where it's like we lay down on the bed, we talk, you know, Andi's really big about like making eye contact, you know, so, or I have to come and sit so that she can see my eyes. You know, there's just a lot of things that we've learned like that are just important to her. To me, it's super important that I'm seen and known in terms of just what I'm doing every day, you know, in terms of my contribution to our family and to our marriage. It's the same with Andi, you know, it looks slightly different for each of us, but it's just important that we hear from each other that, hey, I've seen you, saw you do that. That's really beautiful. You know, or thank you for this. You know, just not taking each other for granted is just a huge thing. When we know we're starting to get a little bit sideways, we use a device that we picked up from a marriage therapist, and it's what I make up about you. So, have you ever heard that?
No, tell me.
It's actually a Brene Brown.
Yeah, it's Brene Brown.
Okay.
Thing. It's a way. It almost builds like a little bit of a buffer. So you could say like, well, right now, what I make up about you is that you are feeling this, or you're thinking I might be feeling this way.
Right.
Okay. So it leaves the idea that like this could not be reality at all.
Right.
Whereas, you know, we can also just kind of come at each other as if, hey, I know exactly what you're thinking. I know exactly what you're feeling. And that just shuts people down immediately. But just even having that little saying of like what I make up about you provides a buffer that you're saying to your partner, like, this may or may not be true. Please help me understand that. So that's a device that we use as well.
I mean, I think what you're describing is that successful marriages, it seems to me, tend to be intentional about creating space within the everyday for intentional pause to signal to one another, you matter to me. I want to understand you. I want you to
Absolutely.
understand me. And that
Yeah.
you do, if you're going to have that experience in the everyday, you actually have to craft out a dedicated space within the everyday for that kind of sacred exchange. And I love the conversational tools you're describing, or finding at times within the day, whether it's the, I think, for some couples, it's the evening, it's the wind down, it's the time in bed. We found in my marriage, we needed a moment in the every week. What we did is about 5 years ago, Jody and I just decided we were going to take Fridays off. We both structured our work so that Fridays were off. And we needed it because the weekends would be consumed with social activities, with hospitality and so forth.
Yeah.
And then Monday to Thursday is, of course, we're doing our life and our work and so forth. And we realized, wow, we actually need a whole day just to be that safety valve, that safety space where, to your point, we don't blindside each other. We know that's a holding place for the longer conversations, or the revelations, or the letting each other discover what's really going on within ourselves. And, I think couples have to find what works for them.
Exactly.
But you can't assume that it will happen in the everyday. That actually part of it is you have to make a choice to actually carve out that space, right?
Yeah, we are big believers that a long marriage is actually many marriages. And that there are these different seasons. It might be 10 years, it might be 5, it might be 20, whatever it is. But it's like, you're growing as people, and you're changing. Your ability to communicate together is different. You may have vocational changes that shift everything. So it's being aware of that. Like, I think probably the best thing that I can tell someone, having been married almost 50 years, is just wait, it will change. Something's going to change. No matter how good it is or how bad it is right now, there will be a change coming. And so wait for it.
And I think it's a good exercise in anniversary moments like the one we're coming up to, the one that you're going to next year, to do that reflection and almost narration of the changing story of your marriage, and almost to say, like, okay, if the last 5 years were a chapter, what would we title that chapter? And how that would be different than the chapter that came before. And what do we think, as we start turning the page, might be the first pages of the plot of the next chapter? Because I think you're absolutely right. It is the best marriages have this sort of narrative dynamic that is full of twists, turns, and unexpected surprises. Sometimes hard things, not sometimes, almost always, some hard things that you have to work through. But it is in the best marriages a beautiful story. One of the things we've been talking about is the belief that it's not just the public, visible, history-making things that matter, but the everyday things that happen in our house, in our home. They also matter so much. And what is lovely, I think, is when those two things come together. When the everyday of our home lives somehow reach out and touch something that is happening out there in the world. And reading your book, I was struck by an example of that. That one of the, I think, history-making movements in American Christianity was the movement in the early 2000s of Christians joining together, public and private, famous and everyday people, to join the effort to save lives in Africa from AIDS, from HIV. And that is, I've said this before on previous podcasts, is one of the great accomplishments that sadly is undertold and underappreciated about what happened. I didn't realize that some of that happened because of a meeting at a home, at your home, it sounds like. So, Charlie, start by telling that story, because I don't think people know this story.
Yeah. We were watching from a distance. I would not say that we were apolitical or unconcerned. We've always, from the time that we were very young Christians, were trained and could see what the word said about in terms of our hospitality extending around the world, and giving of our resources in help in every way that we could. And so our hearts were definitely there. Our hearts were breaking for what was happening on the continent of Africa in terms of debt and AIDS and relief. And we wanted to be a part of it. I think we were doing the part that we knew how to do. And then came along this, wild Irishman, who has a rock band called U2, and
a little band, just a little act.
He's known for some big ideas, and he had already had one big idea based around the Jubilee concept previous to that, which kind of opened him up to American politics, and then he had this idea that, we should all be in the business of caring for our neighbor, but especially Christians. Mm-hmm. And what if I were to use some of my friendships in America, on Capitol Hill and in the church in America, to come and see if I can't galvanize people around the concept that that neighbor love extends to these people who are suffering from the AIDS emergency on the continent of Africa. So we heard about it, and we had filled the room with people who had an interest in activism, or an interest in what was, justice themes, and so, which was exactly what they, wanted, and Bono came, and we sat in the big room, what was the sanctuary of the art house.
It was our living room,
which had become our living room, and filled with folks who wanted to hear from him. And he was incredibly articulate, passionate, and prayerful. And we spent well over 3 hours together, I suppose, right?
Yeah, we had food.
Yeah, we had food.
It was artists and some pastors, mm-hmm. I think, right?
Yeah, some community mm-hmm. leaders.
And what grew out of that? What was the impact of all that meeting?
The thing that grew out of it was that, and this was a thing that a lot of us didn't understand about American politics, is that most politicians can't do anything unless they see some consensus built somewhere, right, to which they can attach themselves to, and so we were fortunate to have then Senator Bill Frist, who was Speaker of the House, and he, or not Speaker, he was the Majority Leader, Senate, and so he was very interested in this topic. He had actually already been to Africa with Bono. Mm-hmm. Eventually, it worked its way, all the way to the White House, and the advent of PEPFAR and making its way into the State of the Union address, and really it was just building this consensus across the church and in the political realm that this is what America wanted to do, that they wanted to move forward in helping and taking it seriously. And it was just a very hard thing, because as you can imagine at that time, even the topic of AIDS, which many Christians had a misunderstanding about the cause of AIDS, specifically on the continent of Africa. And so there was a lot of education that had to happen. And yeah, it was not always pretty,
Yeah.
but it was always about people pointing their compass towards good. There was a unity of vision, and just enough people and the right people kind of in the room, so to speak, that this major thing got done. And when we went backstage to talk to Bono during the 360 tour in 2011 here in Nashville, he put his arm around me and he said, "It all started at your house, didn't it?" And I thought, well, that's very kind of you to say, but I think it started really with this Irishman, coming to America with a big idea that made sense to people who could hear the heartbeat of Jesus.
It's a great story, and one that I wish got more attention, because it is a story of individuals, individual stars like Bono, but also finding a community of artists, Christian artists, and celebrities and politicians gathered in a house, your house,
Yes.
and at least in one of the key gatherings. And it's a great
That's
picture of what can happen when God's Spirit is moving through people, through
Yes.
hospitality, through the Spirit of God convicting us. And just to let people know, the program that we're talking about is called PEPFAR. And I'm not going to be able to remember all the initials, but it's been in place since the early 2000s. It has saved millions of lives. Public health experts would say it is one of the most impactful interventions, public health interventions, in terms of just saving sheer numbers of lives in the world. And it is under threat. It took a major political effort to make it come into being.
That's right.
And I think
It's
every
always
year,
under threat. Yeah.
it's always under threat regularly. I think it was just reauthorized recently for another year, but come, I believe, next spring in 2025, there will be another battle over it. So I do encourage Christians to keep an eye on that. And for those of you who feel called to see the gospel be about the work of saving lives across the world, please keep your attention and your prayers on this program called PEPFAR. So that's a picture of what you would look and say, wow, that's a success of where the everyday realm of hospitality actually met the very public world of impact and history-making changes and so forth. And we would call that a success. Andi, I want to give you the last word, because you end the book by talking about success and saying there's nothing wrong with success, but you've been working with and reflecting more on, in some ways, the difference between success and fruitfulness. Why don't you bring us home with that distinction and why that matters?
Okay. Yes. When we use the word success, so often we are thinking in terms of metrics and numbers as a way of valuing human life. So that kind of has always gotten under my skin a bit, because I thought there's so many instances and people the world over, young people, old people, that this way of valuing life in terms of some kind of metrics just doesn't fit. So I love the word fruitfulness, because it is turning to what Jesus is talking about all the time. And it's fruit bearing that comes from our being connected, abiding in the vine. And it is Christ's life in us as it goes out into the world in some way, whether very small and local and in our families, in our neighborhoods, in our cities, to something large like we just talked about. But that has to do with love, care, that's life-giving, that communicates what it means to love God and love our neighbor as ourselves in a multitude of ways that takes a lifetime and a world's history to, to live out, but it turns it away from us and our accomplishments that we measure or, put on our billboards and our bios and all that, and turns it outward to say, as we live the open palms life of a pilgrim follower of Jesus, and we ask God to make us fruitful, to keep us fresh and green all the way through our lives, and we sort of give back what's given to us, that is a fruitfulness that we can move towards, and sometimes we get to see it, and other people might, reflect back to us. But more than that, it's a life of faith and trust that kind of frees us, I think, from that, the shackle of having to measure, and sort of be up and down according to our numbers, whether our numbers are sales numbers or social media, salaries, money, whatever it is. So that's how it is. That's how I see it.
Well, that's a great picture of a fruitful life. And thank you, Andi and Charlie, for modeling that life and telling about that life in your book, Why Everything That Doesn't Matter Matters So Much. Thank you both for coming here on the Good Faith Podcast and generously sharing your lives with us.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Curtis. Yes, so good to be with you.
And listeners, we will once again come back to this life that we live, which is a mixture of the everyday mundane and the big picture world that we inhabit, which we always, every week, discuss right here as we gather around the campfire. Thanks for listening.